My family ignored me for 29 years and treated me like I was invisible. But when I returned to my city, they appeared out of nowhere. And then I discovered they only wanted me to risk my life as my sister's surrogate mother. I cut them off forever and they never expected my answer. I'm 31 years old. I work in real estate. And I need to tell this story because what happened a few months ago still has me processing a lot of things about my family and about myself. I guess I should start at the beginning. When I was born with a heart condition that basically defined my entire childhood, though not in the way you'd expect. I don't remember much from the early years, honestly. But what I do remember perfectly is the constant feeling of being invisible in my own home, while my sister Rachel shone like she was the only daughter my parents had. Rachel is 2 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, she was the golden child of the family. I don't know if it was because she was born healthy, without medical problems, or simply because my parents connected more with her, but the difference in how they treated us was brutal. She got everything she wanted: new clothes, ballet classes, huge birthday parties with all her friends, while I basically existed in the background. My birthdays were simple dinners at home, if that, and when I asked for something, they'd tell me there was no money, that they had to save for my medications and my cardiologist visits, which, okay, I understand medical expenses are expensive, but it was obvious the money did exist when it came to Rachel. My parents always had this attitude toward me like, well, Emily needs special care, so we can't give her as much as your sister. But the reality is, I felt more like a burden than a daughter. Rachel could do anything, and they'd celebrate her. She'd get good grades and there'd be a party. She'd get bad grades and it was because the teachers didn't understand her. I could get straight A's and barely get a well done. I remember once in middle school I won a writing award, something that was huge for me because I loved writing. And when I got home all excited, my mom barely looked up from her phone and said, "Oh, that's nice, Mija," and kept talking to my aunt about I don't know what thing about Rachel. The only thing that saved me during that time were my grandparents, my mom's parents. They actually saw me. You know? My grandmother always said I had something special, that I was strong despite my weak heart, that I was going to go far. And they didn't just give me encouragement, they literally paid all my medical bills that insurance didn't cover, which was a lot because my condition required constant checkups and expensive medications. They also paid for my entire college education, something my parents never would have done. When it came time to apply to universities, I was determined to go as far away as possible, and my parents didn't even flinch when I told them I was going to a school like 8 hours away. My mom just said, "Well, we hope it goes well for you." And that was it. Rachel, on the other hand, went to state university close to home, and my parents visited her every weekend, sent her care packages with food, paid for the nicest apartment near campus. College was my escape, honestly. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who didn't know anything about my family, who didn't compare me to Rachel, who saw me for who I was. I studied business because I was always good with numbers, and I liked the idea of being financially independent, of never having to depend on anyone. It was in my second year that I met David in an economics class. He was from another state, studying engineering, and he was basically the opposite of everything I'd known in my family. He was attentive. He listened when I talked. He genuinely cared about me. When I told him about my heart condition and the whole story with my family, he didn't treat me differently or pity me. He just hugged me and told me his family was now my family too. We got married 2 years after graduating. I was like 25 years old. It was a small, simple wedding because we didn't have much money yet, and because honestly, I didn't have many important people to invite. My grandparents came, obviously, and some friends from college. I sent invitations to my parents and Rachel more out of obligation than anything else, and none of the three showed up. My mom sent me a message the day before saying Rachel had an important event that weekend, and they had to be there to support her. Not even a real apology. Just that. David was furious. He wanted to call them and tell them off, but I was so used to that dynamic that I just shrugged. It hurt. Of course it did. But it was also like a confirmation of what I'd always known, that I was never going to be a priority for them. The next few years were good. Honestly, David and I built our life together. I started working at a real estate agency and discovered I was pretty good at it. He got an excellent job at an engineering firm. We didn't have much contact with my family, maybe a message at Christmas or birthdays, nothing more. And I was fine with that. I'd made peace with the fact that my biological family was never going to be what I needed. When I was 27, I got pregnant, and it was a whole situation. My cardiologist had warned me since I was a teenager that a pregnancy could be risky for me because of my condition, but David and I wanted a family and decided to try it under strict medical supervision. It was the scariest pregnancy of my life. I literally had to be on almost complete bed rest the last 4 months, with constant monitoring, because my heart was working double what was normal. There were moments when the doctors told us we might have to make very difficult decisions, but in the end, after an emergency C-section and 3 days in the ICU, our son was born. Small but healthy. I spent weeks recovering. My heart had suffered quite a bit with the whole process, but we both survived. The doctors were super clear after that. They told me another pregnancy could kill me. Like, they weren't being dramatic or exaggerating. It was a medical fact. My heart had reached its limit and couldn't handle another pregnancy. David and I processed it, and although it was sad to know we couldn't have more children naturally, we were grateful for our son and for being alive. Eventually, we talked about adoption or maybe surrogacy if someday we wanted another baby, but for now, our family of 3 was perfect. 2 years later, when our son was like 2.5 years old, my grandfather got seriously ill. He had heart problems too, ironically, and my grandmother couldn't take care of him alone. David and I talked and decided to move back to my hometown to be close to them and help. It was a difficult decision because it meant leaving behind the life we'd built, but my grandparents had done so much for me that it was the least I could do. David got a remote job and I transferred to a local real estate office. We moved into a house like 10 minutes from my grandparents. And this is where things got weird. Suddenly, after years of almost no contact, my family started appearing. In my life, my mom called to tell me how good it was that I'd come back, that we should get together more often. My dad sent me messages asking how my son was, if we needed anything for the new house. Rachel, who had basically acted like I didn't exist since my wedding, started inviting me out, to coffee, to family events. I was confused, but also, I don't know. Part of me wanted to believe that maybe things had changed, that maybe they finally saw me as part of the family. For like 3 months, everything was strangely normal. We went to family dinners. Rachel came to visit my son and brought him little gifts. My parents acted like we'd always been a close family. David didn't believe them at all. He told me something didn't add up, that people who ignore you for years don't change just like that. But I wanted to believe it was real. You know, your whole life, wanting your family to love you, and suddenly it seems like they do. It's hard not to cling to that. Then came that family dinner like 6 months ago. It was a normal Sunday. My parents had prepared a big dinner and invited David, me, and our son. Rachel was there with her husband, a guy I always thought was kind of weird, but whatever. The dinner was normal at first. We ate, we talked. My son played with some toys my mom had bought him. And then, when we were on dessert, Rachel pulled out a decorated envelope and gave it to me with this huge smile. I opened it thinking it was an invitation to something. I don't know, maybe a party or an event, but it was a card, one of those cheesy ones with glitter and flowers, and inside it said something like, "Dear Emily, you've been the best sister, and I want to ask you the biggest favor of my life. Would you be the surrogate mother for our baby?" And there was a whole explanation about how Rachel and her husband had been trying to have children for years, but she couldn't get pregnant, that they'd gone to specialists and everything, and that I was their only hope. I froze reading that card. The dining room was completely silent. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my reaction. And the first thing I thought was, oh, that's why. That's why the sudden kindness, the invitations, the interest in my life. It had all been for this. David immediately realized what the card said, because he saw my face and put his hand on my shoulder, like giving me support. I told them I couldn't, that the doctors had been very clear that another pregnancy could kill me. Literally, those were my words. That I could die. And my family's reaction was something I'll never forget. Rachel started crying, saying I was her only option, that we were sisters and sisters help each other. My mom told me I was being dramatic, that doctors always exaggerate, that if I'd survived one pregnancy, I could survive another. My dad looked at me with this huge disappointment and said, "I thought you were finally going to do something for this family." David got up from the table at that moment and told me, "We're leaving." I grabbed my son and we left while Rachel screamed that I was selfish, that I only thought about myself, that she dreamed her whole life of being a mother, and I was taking that opportunity away from her. My mom followed me to the door, telling me to think about it carefully, that this was my opportunity to finally make my sister happy, to show that I cared about the family. We drove home in silence. I was shaking, trying not to cry in front of my son who didn't understand what had happened but knew something was wrong. When I put him to bed that night, David hugged me and told me he couldn't believe what he'd witnessed, that my family was even worse than he'd imagined. And he was right. You know? Like I always knew they treated me differently. But this was another level. They'd basically pretended to be interested in me for months just to use me as an incubator for Rachel's baby, not caring that I could die in the process. The next few days were a nightmare. My mom called me constantly, left long voicemails saying she'd talked to her doctor friend and he said I could surely carry another pregnancy without problems, that I just had to take better care of myself. I sent her the reports from my cardiologist, pages and pages of medical documentation explaining exactly why it was so dangerous, and she responded that I should get a second opinion. Rachel sent me messages every day, sometimes angry, calling me selfish and saying she'd never asked me for anything. Other times sad, saying I was her last hope and how could I deny her this. My dad sent me a message saying that after everything the family had done for me, this was the least I could do, that my grandparents would be disappointed in me. That part hurt, especially because my grandparents would never, ever ask me to risk my life for anything. In fact, when my grandmother found out what was happening, she came to my house personally and hugged me crying, saying she would never forgive me if I did that my life was worth infinitely more than any desire of Rachel's to be a mother. I told my mom, let's meet to talk, thinking that maybe in person and calmly we could reach something. I don't know what I really expected. We met at a coffee shop near my house. She arrived with this attitude like, well, have you thought better about things? I repeated exactly what the doctors had said, that there was a real and high probability that I would die if I tried another pregnancy, that my heart simply couldn't handle it. She looked at me like I was making up excuses and told me, Emily, you've always been the dramatic one in the family. I'm sure it's not as serious as you say. Your sister is suffering. Don't you care about her pain? I asked her if she cared about mine, if she'd ever cared. She was quiet for a moment, and then told me I'd always been difficult, that I'd always made everything about me and my heart and my problems, that Rachel had never asked for anything, and deserved this opportunity. I got up from the table and left without saying anything else because I knew there was no point in continuing that conversation. The next few weeks were basically a constant bombardment. Rachel sent me articles about surrogacy, stories of women who had been surrogates for their sisters, photos of decorated baby rooms. My dad sent me messages like, I thought you were stronger than this, or your sister is devastated by your selfishness. Never, not once, did any of them acknowledge they were asking me to literally risk my life. It was my grandmother who warned me what was coming next. She called me one afternoon. She sounded worried and told me she'd heard my mom and Rachel talking about consulting with lawyers to see if they could force me somehow to be a surrogate. I don't know if that was legally possible. Probably not. But the fact that they were considering it terrified me. David told me it was enough, that we had to protect ourselves legally. We went to a lawyer, explained the whole situation to him, and he helped us prepare cease and desist documentation just in case, and advised us on how to proceed if my family escalated things. We also talked about restraining orders if it became necessary. It was surreal to be sitting in a lawyer's office talking about protecting myself from my own family, but that's how things were. My mom showed up at my house one afternoon without warning. I was working from home and my son was taking his nap. She knocked on the door insistently until I opened, mainly so she wouldn't wake up the kid. She came in without me inviting her and started with how we needed to talk like adults, that I was being immature. I told her we'd already talked enough, and my answer was no. Definitely no. She started crying, saying how could I be so cruel, that Rachel was my sister and needed me. I asked her to leave. She refused, so I had to call David to come home and we literally had to escort her outside while she screamed that I was going to regret this. The final message from my dad came like a week later. It was long. Talked about how disappointed they were in me, how I'd turned out to be a selfish and ungrateful daughter after everything they'd done for me. He mentioned all the times they'd taken me to the doctor as a kid, as if that was a special favor and not a basic obligation of being a parent. He said, Rachel was devastated and it was my fault, that I'd chosen my comfort over my sister's happiness. It ended saying not to contact them until I was ready to do the right thing and be part of the family for real. I read that message like 3 times, waiting to feel something, guilt maybe, or sadness, but all I felt was relief. Like they'd finally completely taken off the mask, and I could see with total clarity what had always been my role in that family: to be useful, to be convenient, to sacrifice myself for Rachel. And I decided I wasn't going to keep playing that role anymore. I blocked my parents' and Rachel's numbers. I told my grandmother I loved her but didn't want to know anything about what my mom or Rachel said or did. She understood completely, told me she supported me, and so did my grandfather. My grandparents continued being part of our life. They came to see my son. We had dinner together on Sundays, but we didn't talk about my mom or Rachel unless it was absolutely necessary. It's been 6 months since all that. My life now is peaceful. Honestly. I work, spend time with David and my son, visit my grandparents. I don't have that constant anxiety I used to have when I had to deal with my family. Sometimes I think about everything that happened and wonder if I did the right thing, if I should have tried to explain to them one more time, but then I remember I tried many times and they simply didn't want to listen because what I felt or needed was never important to them. Rachel had her baby like 2 months ago. I found out through my grandmother. They ended up using a surrogate they found through an agency. My grandmother showed me photos of the baby. She's cute, obviously. I asked my grandmother if it felt weird for her, being divided between us like that, and she told me there was no division, that she loved me and loved Rachel too, but that what my parents and Rachel had done to me was wrong, and she was never going to pretend otherwise. My son asked me the other day why he doesn't see Grandma on Mom's side anymore, meaning my mom. I told him the truth, adapted to his age, that sometimes families have problems and need space. He thought about it for a moment and then said, "But we have the good Grandpa and Grandma, right?" Referring to my grandparents, I told him yes, that we were very lucky to have them, and he hugged me and kept playing like nothing. I think that's what has helped me most to make peace with all this, realizing I can give my son something I never had, a family that sees him, that values him, that will never ask him to sacrifice himself for someone else. David and I, my grandparents, we're his real family, and honestly, that's more than I had for a long time. Sometimes I get messages from unknown numbers, probably my mom or Rachel using friends' phones or whatever, telling me I should meet my niece, that family is forever, that someday I'm going to regret this. I delete them without reading beyond the first few words. There's nothing they can say that changes what happened or how they treated me my whole life. Last week, my son and I were baking cookies, something we do often because he loves helping in the kitchen, even though he makes more mess than anything. He asked me if he could take cookies to Grandma and Grandpa, and we went that same afternoon. My grandfather, who's much better health-wise now, played with him in the yard, while my grandmother and I had tea in the kitchen. She asked me how I really was, not just the typical fine. I told her the truth, that I was fine, that it didn't hurt like before, that I'd accepted my mom. Dad and Rachel were never going to be what I needed, and I was okay with that. She took my hand and told me she was proud of me, of the woman I'd become, of the mother I was, of the strength I had, and that, coming from someone who really knows and loves me, was worth more than any validation I could have ever received from my parents. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. Maybe someday my mom or Rachel will try to contact me again. Maybe not. Maybe in a few years when my son is older and asks harder questions about why he doesn't see that part of the family, I'll have to have complicated conversations. But for now, I'm at peace with my decisions. I chose my life, my health, my real family over people who only saw me as a means to get what they wanted. And if that makes me selfish according to them, I guess I can live with that.